We had multiple questions on one of these topics that you just kind of laid out there, David, and that's proximal hamstring tendinopathy. So here's kind of the questions. Heebie-Jeebies asks, what can be done for rehab and management of proximal hamstring tendinitis? And then Fox in Socks in Box with No asks, what do you recommend for insertional hamstring tendinopathy? And we're assuming that insertional means inserting into the bone proximally up by the sit bone. So I've been doing a little bit of work on this. I have a couple athletes who've been dealing with proximal hamstring tendinopathy. So there's a really great article by a guy named Tom Goom. He's actually running physio if you want to like look him up, but he's an awesome physiotherapist, has a lot of continuing education for runners. If you are a PT and you want to do a course, he has what's called the running repairs course. It's an online CEU that you can do. I think it's really good stuff. And he's got a really great clinical commentary that came out a bit ago about runners with proximal hamstring tendinopathy. And I think the big thing about proximal hamstring tendinopathy, just remember it's at that point where it's inserting into your sit bone, you're often going to get kind of like what feels like deep buttock pain. Sometimes it feels like it radiates up into the buttock a little bit more. Sometimes it radiates down the leg a little bit. And oftentimes the people feel pain at that point where there's the highest hamstring activation, which is right either as or right after that foot is hitting the ground. Remember, your hamstring is contracting to slow your limb down, and then it helps a little bit with that shock absorption. And that's the point where people who have proximal hamstring tendinopathy tend to feel their symptoms. And it's actually a real bugger to treat. And part of that is because the issue is not only the activation of the hamstring, but it's also the compression of that tendon. So if you can picture yourself bringing your knee to your chest and you have, the tendon sticking into a bone, that tendon gets stretched, but also compressed and like bent over that sit bone. And so one of the issues with this is that you not only need to moderate the amount of loading that goes through the tendon from a force production perspective, you have to limit the amount of compression. And the way that you can do that from a rehab perspective is limiting the amount of hip flexion or bringing your knee towards your chest when you're doing different activities. So if you're, for example, for some people, skipping a step might be painful, but a single step as you're going upstairs might not. And that's because you're going into less hip flexion. If you're running faster, as you're bringing your leg forward and if your knee is coming higher, that's more hip flexion. You might get more compression of the tendon during that deceleration phase. So there's a lot of things that can lead to increased irritation that are very minute changes. So running at 8 versus a 7 versus a 6 minute per mile might be the thing that flares it back up as you're trying to get in on your rehab. There's kind of, the name of the game is load management. You have to do the right type of loading. But you can't do no loading at all. If you just rest, this is one of those things that isn't going to get better on a cellular level. It has to do with ultimately there's changes in like what's called ground substance, but it comes to changes in what's called collagen. And it means that you have to give it the right load to train it to go back to the proper orientation, which we know in the Achilles tendon can take about 9 months. So we don't know exactly what that looks like in the hamstring. It's a little bit more squirrely in terms of our ability to see it when we're doing research when it comes to like diagnostic ultrasound. But a lot of those principles probably still apply where this is a long-term process. You can't hope for changes in 2 weeks. You can't hope for changes in 6 weeks. You can't hope for changes in 8 weeks. You got to think like 3, 6, 9 months of a rehab process, which on the front end, if you have that in your head, that can be really helpful. That also means you just have to be super patient when it comes to running. Because like I said, if you try to go too fast, too soon, it might be the one thing that just flares it back up and just sets you back a little bit. That does not mean that it's the end, you have to start completely over, but it's just one of those road bumps where you just have to be okay being patient and then being smart with the types of exercises that you're doing. So when I can't go into like all the details, but I will give a couple more kind of tidbits on like progressing yourself through. If you're having pain just like sitting on a chair, if you're having pain just with walking or just with stairs, I would say you're probably in a more high irritability state, which means that your loading exercises should be ones that aren't putting compression through the tendon. And that means, as I just said, like keeping your hip fully extended or straight. You don't want your hip bent. So the only way to do exercises without kind of moving into flexion are isometrics. So isometric bridges, if you have like I think it's called a Roman chair. That's what I call them, where you can kind of like put your heels in and kind of bend forward. You can just hold your body at like at an incline and just do single leg holds. We actually have some exercises posted on our Instagram about proximal hamstring tendinopathy. We're through 3 of 4 phases of rehab. But you got to start really easy with these long isometric holds. That helps with pain modulation. That helps with starting that process. And once your pain comes down enough, that's where you start to add in hip flexion. That's where you start to put your feet on the ground. That's where you start to add in mini squats, maybe some lunges. There's all these different kinds. There's no magic exercise. It's all about the right exercise at the right time. But you can't just push through pain with this either. Pain is a bit of a sign for you as you progress, and it's recommended right now not to go more than about a 2 out of 10 on kind of a 0 to 10 pain scale, which I usually say is like a dull ache. If it comes to that like noticeable ache or starting to be on like, if you would actually define it as pain versus just like achiness, that's too much. It's got to stay a little bit low, and it's got to stay low during the exercise and 24 hours after the exercise. One really nice way to know is if the exercises that you're doing are too much is you can pick a movement like a single leg bridge, and you can do one in the morning and you rate it on a scale of 0 to 10. How painful was it to do that thing? Then you do your activities for that day. The next morning, you do the same bridge in the same position at the same time. And then you say, was it a 0 out of 10, 2 out of 10, 4 out of 10, whatever it is, and you watch your trends. If your trends are getting worse, you know your activity is too much. If they're staying the same, you're in a pretty good spot, depending on how high that level is. If they're coming down, obviously you're heading the right direction. So I just word vomited for way too long. David, what do you want to talk about with proximal hamstring tendinopathy?
No, I think you hit it great. I mean, there was a couple things that go through my head immediately. One of them was irritability, and then one is pain modulation. And you kind of covered that pretty well. And looking into the range of motion, like, okay, what are we comfortable doing? And it's like, if we can't flex at the hip and extend our leg, well, then why would we do those exercises if it's just going to piss it off, to be frank. And so I think it's great, working in a straight leg position. You can still work a lot of coordinated things and get a lot of great work done without doing, these drop lunges or RDLs or, actually an RDL, depending on the person, again, right? Mm-hmm. Looking at the individual. But it's just using the information you have in front of you and creating a plan that works for the individual and feels productive. And it's like, if you're able to get work done and your nervous system's okay with it, that helps tremendously with pain. Yeah. Like, the brain starts to trust it again, and that nervous system starts to calm down. You'd be surprised, like, how many times something's been, like, just a little guarded, and then the second that the brain feels like it's okay, everything lets go, and all of a sudden there's, like, the limitations fall off. And that's not the case for everybody, but sometimes someone kind of needs that permission from themselves to, like, go into that next area of activity. And sometimes it does take taking a step or two back initially to realize that and be like, oh, wait, I am okay. Okay. And then it's fine. That's not the case with all things, right? I mean, when we talk about tendinopathies, usually these things have been around for a while. So we talked about it earlier, but having these kind of more longer vision approaches and knowing that there might be some ebbs and flows depending on the type of work that you're putting in, mileage, speed, whatever. But I think also being comfortable with the ebbs and flows and having a psychological readiness for that can be so helpful.
100%. Yeah. Because then I think as you just talked about, the influence of how we approach the reality of discomfort can really influence how we experience that over time. And it's both a warning sign to us in terms of what our body can tolerate, but also a normal part of the adaptation process if you're going to go through loading. The important part about exercise in my mind too is if you have a proximal hamstring issue and you either limit your running, run differently, or don't run at all, you don't want to lose the overall capacity of that muscle. So you want to do as much, loading and strengthening as you can. without aggravating that tendon, so that you maintain all of the strength and power that was there before. And I think that's what's missed a lot too in rehab programs. If you do end up working with a PT, is you get to a really good functional spot with pretty mumuch everything, even like easy running, but your rehab protocol, either because insurance runs out or you can't keep going to PT from a time standpoint, we miss out on the power training. And hamstrings are very powerful muscles. Like, they're made up of a lot of type 2 fibers. They're quick, fast twitch. And so they fire when we go fast. And if we don't train that during a rehab process, that could re-aggravate once you really go back. So that's just another consideration for why strengthening is so important.